Imagine that you wake up one morning in the 13th century and learn that you have just inherited a pyramid. Yes, an actual pyramid, the kind of thing that people in our time pay a plane ticket to see. But in your medieval world, there are no plane tickets, no postcards, and no gift shops. Instead, there's just you, your new stone property, and a very old question that nobody has ever answered properly. What is a pyramid actually worth? And more importantly, what does it cost you to own one? So let us slow down, take a deep breath, and walk through the economics of being a pyramid owner in the Middle Ages. Because the moment you sit down and do the math, you discover that the pyramids were a magnificent, ancient, and gloriously expensive problem. And the story of how medieval rulers dealt with that problem is one of the strangest business cases in all of history. First, a little orientation, because you need to understand what you have just inherited. The Great Pyramid of Giza, the one built for the pharaoh Khufu, went up around 2,500 years before the birth of Christ. That means that by the time the Middle Ages began in Europe, the pyramids were already older than Rome is today, older than almost every building anyone in the medieval world had ever seen. They were ancient when the ancient world itself was young. And by the time you inherit one, you're looking at a structure that has stood for roughly 3,500 years. So the first thing to understand is that you're not owning something new. You are owning a very old, very heavy, and very weathered piece of real estate, and that changes everything about how much it is worth. Now, here's the part that surprises most people. In the Middle Ages, the pyramids were not considered sacred monuments the way we think of them today. They were not even considered tourist attractions. They were generally understood to be enormous piles of stone that belonged to whoever happened to rule Egypt. Because in the era we're talking about, roughly the 12th and 13th centuries, Egypt was ruled by a series of powerful families. First the Fatimids, then the Ayyubids led by the famous Saladin and his descendants, and after that the Mamluks. And in all of these periods, the pyramids were treated as state property, which means that if you are the Sultan and you inherit Egypt, you also inherit the pyramids, whether you want them or not. So let's talk about what you actually own. The Giza Plateau sits across the Nile from Cairo, and on its stand three great pyramids. The Pyramid of Khufu, the largest, the Pyramid of Khafre, the middle one, and the Pyramid of Menkaure, the smallest of the three. If you are the ruler, you own all of them, along with the smaller pyramids around them. And the first thing any sensible owner would ask is, what can I do with this? The answer, as you are about to see, is far less glamorous than you might hope. The first possibility is simply to keep the pyramids as they are, to admire them, to let visitors come and wonder at them, and to enjoy the prestige of ruling over such ancient wonders. And this was a real thing. Medieval travelers and scholars did come to Egypt and write about the pyramids. The great Arab historian al-Masudi, who lived in the 10th century, wrote an enormous book called The Meadows of Gold, and in it he described the pyramids in loving detail. Later, in the 14th century, the famous traveler Ibn Battuta made his way to Egypt, stood before the pyramids, and wrote about them too. So there was a genuine tourist curiosity even back then. But here is the catch. Tourism in the Middle Ages did not make anyone rich. There were no entry fees, no gift shops, no hotels built for pyramid tourists. A few pilgrims and scholars passed through, and that was about it. So keeping the pyramid as a monument earned you almost nothing. The second possibility is where the real medieval thinking comes in. You could treat the pyramid as a quarry, a giant source of ready-made building stone. And this, more than anything else, is what actually happened. Over the centuries, huge numbers of the smooth, white casing stones that once covered the pyramids were pulled off and carried away to build the streets, mosques, and houses of the fast-growing city of Cairo. The pyramids of Giza originally had smooth outer layers of fine white limestone, carefully cut and polished so that the whole structure gleamed in the sun. And in the Middle Ages, these stones became building material for the living city. So your pyramid, in a very real sense, was being slowly eaten block by block to feed the construction boom of Cairo. And this brings us to the third possibility, the one that fascinated medieval rulers the most, the dream of treasure. You see, for centuries, people believed that the pyramids were hiding vast riches inside. Gold, jewels, the treasure of the pharaohs, great chambers sealed for thousands of years. And this legend was everywhere. Al-Masudi wrote about the ancient kings who supposedly stored their wealth and knowledge inside the pyramids. And generations of treasure hunters believed that if you could only break in, you would find wonders beyond imagination. So if you were a sultan who has just inherited a pyramid, the obvious question is, why not crack it open and take the treasure? And that is exactly what some medieval rulers actually tried to do. And here is the part of the story that makes this such a perfect lesson in economics. The most famous attempt to destroy a pyramid was made by a man who had every reason to believe the treasure was real, and it failed. Not because of piety and not because of respect for ancient monuments, but because the math did not work. The man was Sultan Al-Aziz Uthman, the son of the great Saladin. He ruled Egypt in the late 12th century, from around 1193 to 1198, and he decided that he was going to take his pyramids apart, stone by stone, searching for whatever was hidden inside. So picture the scene. The Sultan gathers a large workforce: engineers, stonemasons, laborers, thousands of men. He tells them to start dismantling one of the pyramids. And this is where the economics begins to bite. The pyramid he chose to attack was the Pyramid of Menkaure, the smallest of the three great pyramids at Giza. Yet even that smallest pyramid is a mountain of stone built from blocks that weigh several tons each. Moving just one of those blocks off the pyramid, lowering it down, and hauling it away is backbreaking, slow, and expensive work. And after months of effort, the workers had only managed to peel away a relatively small amount. The Sultan finally looked at the cost, looked at the slow progress, and understood that he was looking at a project that would take a lifetime and empty his treasury before he ever reached anything valuable inside. So he gave up, and the Pyramid of Menkaure still bears a great gash on its north face, a permanent scar left by this medieval demolition attempt. Now, let us think hard about why that project failed, because it is the perfect illustration of the economics of owning a pyramid. The first problem is the sheer scale. A pyramid is not a house, and it is not even a castle. It is a mountain shaped by human hands. The Great Pyramid alone contains millions of tons of stone, built from over 2 million blocks, and even the smallest of the three Great Pyramids is still unimaginably heavy. So the first rule of pyramid economics is that you are never going to move all of it. The only question is how much of it you can move before you run out of money. The second problem is the cost of labor. In the Middle Ages, building and demolition were done by hand, by men with hammers, chisels, ropes, sledges, and wooden ramps. Every single block had to be broken, dragged, lifted, and carried by human muscle, and all of those workers had to be fed, housed, and paid. The more workers you hired to go faster, the more money you spent every single day. So the Sultan faced the classic business trap: go slow, and it takes forever. Go fast, and you burn through gold. And no matter which way he turned, the numbers pointed to ruin. The third problem is transport. And this one is easy to forget because the pyramid stones are not just heavy. They are heavy and awkward and far from anywhere useful. The Giza Plateau is several kilometers from the center of Cairo, and in the Middle Ages, there were no paved roads and no trucks. Every stone had to be dragged across the desert by teams of men and oxen, and the farther you had to move the stone, the more it cost. So even though the building stone itself was valuable, by the time you paid for the labor to extract it and the labor to cart it to the city, the profit was slim. In many cases, the stone was not worth moving at all. That is why the best stone, the fine white casing, disappeared first because it was worth the trouble, while the rougher interior blocks stayed where they were, because nobody could afford to move them. And this, right here, is the deep truth of pyramid economics. The pyramids are worth less than the cost of taking them apart. The value of the stone and the value of the treasure that might or might not be inside. None of it is enough to pay for the enormous cost of dismantling a mountain. And that is why, despite the legends and despite the ambitions of more than one ruler, the pyramids survived. Not because anyone loved them, but because nobody could afford to destroy them. It was simply too expensive to be a successful pyramid breaker. Now, let us talk about the treasure question more carefully because it changed how people saw the pyramids, and it changed the economics in a very real way. The belief that the pyramids held great riches was powerful and widespread, and it drove a lot of activity. People broke into the pyramids, tunneled into them, and searched for hidden chambers. And here is the uncomfortable truth that the medieval treasure hunters eventually learned. The pyramids had been robbed long, long ago, thousands of years before the Middle Ages. The tombs of the pharaohs had been opened and looted in ancient times, and by the time the medieval world came along, whatever treasure had once been there was already gone. So the great economic promise of the pyramids, the promise of hidden gold, was mostly a myth, and the people who spent real money chasing it were spending that money on a dream that had already proven empty. But the legend did not fade easily, and it is worth understanding why, because it tells us something about how people value things. The pyramids were so vast, so ancient, and so mysterious that people simply could not believe they were empty. Surely, they reasoned, such a colossal structure must contain something worth all that stone. And so the legend persisted for centuries, even as generation after generation of diggers found nothing. And this is a wonderful lesson. The value people assigned to the pyramids in their imagination was far greater than the value the pyramids could actually deliver. And that gap between imagined value and real value is, in many ways, the true story of the pyramid economy. So let us now talk about what an owner actually got out of a pyramid in the Middle Ages beyond the dream of treasure. The answer is a mix of things, some practical and some purely symbolic. Practically, the pyramid gave you prestige. To rule over the most ancient wonders of the world was a kind of power in itself. Travelers came, scholars wrote about you, and your name was attached to the greatest monuments on earth. And in a world where rulers fought constantly for reputation and glory, that symbolic value was real. It did have worth, just not the kind of worth you could count in gold coins. Practically, the pyramid gave you building material, as we have seen, and this was actually the most reliable economic use of the pyramids over the centuries. The white casing stones fed the construction of Cairo, and mosques and palaces rose using stone that had once covered the pharaohs. So in a strange way, the pyramids were being recycled into the city, their stone living a second life in the walls of the medieval capital. And if you were a smart ruler, you could see the pyramids as a slow, steady source of income, not a quick treasure grab, but a quarry that would keep producing useful stone for generations. Though even this came with a warning, because as the easiest stone was stripped away, the cost of getting more rose, and at a certain point the remaining stone was simply not worth the effort. And then there were the more unusual costs of ownership, the kind that nobody puts in a budget, but that every pyramid owner had to deal with. First, there was the simple burden of being responsible for such a thing. A pyramid is a massive object sitting on valuable land. It casts a shadow, it blocks space, and it is quite hard to do anything else with the ground it stands on. Second, there was the cost of dealing with the people who came to dig for treasure, because when the legend is strong, you get a constant stream of people trying to break in, and a ruler who wanted to keep some order around the pyramids had to manage that. And third, there was the cost of the failed ambitions themselves. Every time a ruler decided to tear a pyramid apart, that ruler spent enormous sums and got nothing in return. And the record of medieval Egypt is full of money spent on dreams that the pyramids could not fulfill. Let us also consider the strange fact that the pyramids were, in a sense, too big to destroy. And this is a genuinely important economic idea, because it explains why these ancient structures made it all the way to modern times. The cost of destroying a pyramid, whether to find treasure or just to clear the land, was always greater than the value of what you would get. So every rational ruler, once they actually did the math, decided to leave the pyramids alone and walked away. And the pyramids, unloved, unprofitable, and far too expensive to remove, simply stayed where they were for thousands of years. That is the ironic triumph of the pyramids. They were protected not by guards or walls, but by the simple fact that nobody could afford to get rid of them. Now, let us spend a moment on the actual numbers, because this is a story about economics, and we should be honest about what we know and what we do not know. The truth is that medieval records do not give us tidy price lists for pyramid stones or pyramid demolition contracts. The people of that time did not write down the kind of detailed financial documents we would love to have. So we cannot say, with certainty, that a single casing stone cost this many coins, or that a day of labor cost that many more. But what we do know from the sources that survive is the shape of the economics. We know that the rulers who tried to dismantle the pyramids found the cost overwhelming. We know that the white casing stones were valuable enough to be taken away in great numbers. And we know that the interior stone was left behind because it was not worth moving. Those facts sketch a very clear picture of a property that cost more to exploit than it was worth to own. And we can reason about the numbers in a careful, honest way without inventing details because we know the size of the job. We know that the Great Pyramid contains well over 2 million stone blocks. We know that even the smallest Great Pyramid represents an enormous amount of material. And we know that in the medieval world, every block had to be moved by muscle power alone. So we can be confident in the general conclusion. The labor bill for dismantling a pyramid would have been staggering, far beyond what any treasury could sustain for long. And that is not speculation. That is the logical consequence of the physical facts we know to be true. Now let us zoom out and look at the bigger economic picture, because the pyramid story is really a story about how value works and about how the value of a thing depends on what you can do with it. The pyramids were enormously valuable as ideas, as symbols, as wonders. But economically, in the harsh terms of medieval labor and transport costs, they were a liability. And this is a pattern you see again and again in economic history. A thing can be priceless in the imagination and worthless in the ledgers. The pyramids were the impossible combination, priceless and unprofitable at the same time. And there's another layer to this, which is the role of the city. Cairo was booming in the Middle Ages. It was one of the greatest cities in the world, a center of trade, learning, and power. And that boom is exactly what ate the pyramids, because a growing city needs stone, and the pyramids were the nearest, largest, and easiest source of free building material. So the more Cairo grew, the more pyramid casing disappeared. And in a way, the pyramids funded the rise of the medieval city. Their stone became the bones of Cairo, and so the economics of the pyramids were tied to the economics of the city in a deep and lasting way. Let us also think about the people who benefited from the pyramids in the Middle Ages, because it was not the rulers. It was the workers, the stonemasons, the laborers, the boatmen, the men who quarried the stone, hauled it, and sold it. And this is a subtle but important point. The pyramid economy, such as it was, put food on the table for a great many ordinary people, even if it never made anyone rich. So when you think about the medieval pyramid, you should picture not just a sultan and his failed treasure hunt, but also the quiet, steady industry of the stone trade, the daily labor of the men who turned an ancient monument into a living city. And this brings us to a question that might be on your mind. What would you do if you actually inherited a pyramid in the Middle Ages? The honest answer, based on the evidence, is that the smartest thing you could do is almost nothing. You would hold on to it, because it is a symbol of power and a source of prestige. You would let the stone trade continue, because it provides some steady, modest value. And you would absolutely resist the temptation to tear it down, because every recorded attempt to do so ended in financial failure. So the best pyramid owner, in economic terms, was the owner who did the least, who let the pyramid be a pyramid, and who understood that its value was in its existence, not in its exploitation. And that is a genuinely useful economic principle, and it applies far beyond pyramids. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can do with an asset is to leave it alone, to stop trying to wring a profit out of it, and to let it simply be what it is. The medieval rulers who understood this kept their treasure, at least in the form of an intact monument, while the rulers who did not understand it, like Al-Aziz Uthman, spent their gold and got nothing but a scar on a stone face. So the pyramid is not just a wonderful story. It is a lesson in restraint and in the difference between imagined value and real value. Now, let us make sure we are being accurate about the timeline, because it matters for the story. The Middle Ages in Egypt ran through several distinct eras, and the pyramid economy existed through all of them. The Fatimid caliphs, who ruled from the 10th to the 12th century, were the ones who built the great city of Cairo, and it was under them that the stone trade really began to feed the new capital. Then came Saladin and the Ayyubids in the late 12th century, and it was one of Saladin's own sons, Al-Aziz Uthman, who made the famous and failed attempt to demolish the Pyramid of Menkaure. And after that came the Mamluks, the soldier rulers who dominated Egypt for centuries, and under them the process continued. Cairo kept growing, and pyramid stone kept flowing into the city. So the pyramids were, for the entire medieval period, a slowly depleting resource, a larder of stone that the Egyptian state drew on as needed. And it is worth being precise about one thing. The pyramids were not owned by individuals in the way we might imagine. There was no deed, no title, no private owner. They were crown land, state property, and the ruler of the day controlled them. So when we talk about a pyramid owner, we are really talking about the ruler, the sultan, the caliph, or the state he represented. And that is an important distinction because it means the pyramids were managed for the benefit of the state, not for the profit of any single person. And the state, as it turned out, was never able to make the pyramids pay any more than any individual could. And here is one more economic wrinkle that is worth your attention. The pyramids were, in a sense, a trap for the ambitious because they offered a reward that did not exist. Generations of rulers poured money into the pyramids, believing there was gold inside, and that money disappeared. And so the pyramids did not just fail to make their owners wealthy. They actively made some of them poorer. They consumed the wealth of those who tried to plunder them. And in doing so, they protected their own treasure, which was not gold, but sheer, overwhelming mass. The pyramids were the ultimate locked box, not because the lock was strong, but because the box was too heavy to open. So let us now bring all of this together and give you the honest bottom line. If you inherited a pyramid in the Middle Ages, you inherited the most magnificent financial white elephant the world has ever known. It was beautiful, it was famous, it made you look powerful, and it was, in every practical sense, a money pit. The treasure inside was a myth. The stone was only worth taking while the easy stone lasted, and the cost of destroying it was greater than the value of anything you could get from it. Your best move was to hold on to it, admire it. Let the city take what easy stone it could and never, ever try to tear it down. And that, in the end, is why the pyramids are still standing today, while the palaces of the rulers who tried to destroy them have crumbled into dust. The pyramids survived because they were too expensive to destroy. The rulers who understood that left them alone and were remembered mostly for other things. And the rulers who did not understand it spent their fortunes on a dream and achieved nothing but a scar. So the pyramids are not just the triumph of ancient engineering. They're the triumph of mathematics, the mathematics of cost and value. And they stand today as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is not an army and not gold, but the simple arithmetic of what a thing costs versus what it is worth. Now, let me leave you with a few thoughts that tie the whole story together. First, remember that the value of a thing is not fixed. It depends on what you can do with it. And in the Middle Ages, the pyramids could not be sold, could not be lived in, and could not be profitably torn apart. So their practical value was low, even though their symbolic value was immense. Second, remember that the cost of labor and transport shapes everything. In a world without machines, moving stone was so expensive that it made even the greatest monuments immune to destruction. And third, remember that a legend can be a very expensive thing to believe. The treasure myth drove rulers to spend fortunes chasing nothing. And that is a lesson that has not lost its power in the centuries since. And if you take nothing else from this story, take this. Sometimes the wisest owner is the one who does the least. The pyramids were saved by the patience and the restraint of the people who chose not to destroy them. And they thrive to this day because enough rulers, over enough centuries, did the math and decided that the wonder was worth more standing than it could ever be worth in pieces. So the next time you see a picture of the pyramids, or stand before them yourself, remember that you are looking at a monument that survived not because anyone protected it, but because it was simply too expensive to destroy. And that, more than anything, is the economics of owning a pyramid in the Middle Ages, a story of a mountain of stone that was priceless as a wonder, worthless as an asset, and absolutely impossible to get rid of. And that is the strange, wonderful, and very human truth of the pyramid economy. Thank you for listening, and if this story made you smile, or made you think, then it has done exactly what the pyramids themselves have done for thousands of years, which is to remind us that the biggest and most beautiful things in the world are often the ones that no one could ever truly own.